So this is not an apology, it's expectation management. So as far as images go, that's all you get. So it's just going to be text, wall of text. It's basically my notes, and you're looking at my notes. I'm not going to present any data or results of any performances or any of the diagrams, but rather I'm just going to talk you through a proposal of how to investigate some questions around self-listening for music generation. There's a strong connection, but I guess you could say what I'm going to talk about is the complement of the previous talk, and I think Alice and Paul were correct in putting us together because we're looking at very similar issues but from the opposite direction. So instead of focusing on the sense of being listened to, I'm interested in looking at an agent, how you could create a system that where the emphasis isn't on it listening to others or others listening to it, but it listening to itself. And I think that investigating one of these, naturally these go together. You don't just have a self-listening system, but if you've got the ability to listen and evaluate others, you thereby almost automatically have a way to listen to and evaluate oneself and vice versa. So let's see if I can keep track of where I am. Okay. Right. This isn't really anything I'm going to propose investigating in detail. It's just sort of like a motivating hypothesis. Seems to me that auditory self-monitoring on multiple timescales, it is not just the generation of a particular vocalization, say in the case of singing, but also, say, in instrumental music over longer gestural timescales. It's crucial for giving human music making, including singing, its particular character. And so a research question that follows from someone who has that belief is, to what extent might machine listening be used to confer on some kind of music generation system this self-listening capability, and use that self-listening capability to break new ground, say, in music generation. So one proposal is that we could answer this question, I could answer this question, maybe we could answer this question by, if we answer this question, we can better understand maybe music generation in general. What do I mean by self-listening? So I'm not being prescriptive here, this is how we should use the term, but just to let you know what I'm going to mean by it in this talk, what it is that I'm interested in when I talk about self-listening. So I mean to distinguish it from merely internal self-monitoring. So there are lots of systems that might reflect on their internal, say, computational goings-on. I'm interested in self-listening in the sense that the system reuptakes its sonic output as input. So there has to actually be sonic output, or at least in potential sonic output. And that sonic output of the system, say the music it makes, sound it generates, the system has to be such that it can actually hear sound. It can hear the sound of others and the sound it itself makes. And the reuptake of that and the processing of it and then evaluation of it is what I mean by self-listening. So for instance, I wouldn't mean merely a algorithm that comes up with some symbolic specification of the sound that it's going to make. Maybe it's going to send this MIDI sequence to some sound generator. And so reflecting on that symbolic specification of sound and processing it and reasoning about that isn't what I have in mind by self-listening. That's not actually listening in my sense. Listening really involves encountering the actual vibrations in the air. Or at least encountering structures that are aiming to predict or model those vibrations in the air. So for those of you, this is just an aside concerning predictive processing, which is a trendy topic in cognitive science, my field. For those of you who know what that is, there's an aside here I'd like to make. So there's actually a Sussex person, one of the founders of the cognitive science group here, Max Clues. He's the one, as far as we can tell, who came up with this idea that perception is controlled hallucination, and a lot of the predictive processing people have been running with this slogan. You hear it a lot in that crowd. Andy Clark and Sept use this slogan. So if we think of perception, even maybe musical perception, as controlled hallucination, the control there, I'm thinking of that as not just being from within, but from without. So in this case, there is some prediction going on, and there's control of the creative process or the music generation process, but it isn't entirely from within. It's actually being constrained by this kind of evaluation of feedback. So it's not just feedback, in a way I'll make clear in a second, but it's evaluation of that feedback. So that kind of letting that, the part of the sonic environment that one is responsible for play a role in your future interventions in that environment, that's what I'm talking about. So it's, as I said, it's distinct from mere feedback or machine listening, say, in general, in at least two ways. When I say it, I mean the notion that I'm interested in exploring. Evaluation is, what I mean by that is that the, I guess delete the second, the A there should be gone. The self-listening's own output is not merely fed back to the system. That's been done. Many people have explored that. I think someone's already mentioned these simple loop systems back in the 70s. But actually, in the case I'm interested in, this particular self-listening rather than mere self-hearing, perhaps, is that the system is evaluating that fed-back signal as if it were the musical output of others, say. It treats it just as any other kind of musical input, in a sense. In a sense, it will treat it differently in a way that I'll explain later. But the point is that it's available for perception and affective evaluation, responding to, as if it were coming from others. And by that should let you know that by evaluation I mean more than mere categorization or pattern recognition. I mean it will involve categorization and pattern recognition, but it will also be inherently connected to certain kinds of preference-related actions. So, to evaluate something positively will be to want to seek it out in the future, to make it more likely you will try to create that sound or a similar sound if you are trying to create sounds in the future. Will be typically a connect to affective state or emotional state that is expressed in social context. So if you had a robot here, it might smile, it's capable of smiling, somehow demonstrate that it has positively evaluated the sound that it's heard. And that's related very much to the talk that Nick and Tom gave. It opens the door to that kind of perception of being listened to. It opens up to social norms in that by expressing your evaluation, you are now possibly giving feedback to others and letting them know how you are evaluating them. So all those issues that came up on the previous talk get going. But by self-listening, I don't just mean that there's that kind of evaluation that goes beyond categorization and pattern recognition, but also, and connected with that, there's a role in, evaluation is meant to play a role in control and in attention. So mere passive self-listening would just be merely being affected by one's own output and that possibly affecting your future output. But I have something in mind, ultimately, maybe one has to investigate passive self-listening first, but I'd be interested in more active self-listening, where the system actually attempts to segment, to find the part of the signal for which that system is causally responsible by looking at dependencies in the signal and its recent history of interventions. Find that part of the signal that it does have control over in the control theoretic sense, and attempt to, and evaluate that especially, because that's the part of the signal it can actually influence, so that's the part of the signal it will pay attention to. It'll give a certain kind of special attention to that part of the signal when considering what sound to make next. This will be a changing estimation, so it's going to be dynamic, which part of the signal I'm currently having an effect on or can have an effect on. And so it can therefore be, it's fallible. It might not be correct in some sense of correctly. The system might think it has some control over aspects of the sonic space that it doesn't, or it might think that, it might neglect parts of the sonic environment that it is having a big effect on, but it might not realize that. And also it might not correspond much to our intuitive notions about, well, what sound is the system making. We might not realize that there are knock-on effects that, in effect, this system is controlling, even though it's not coming out of its speakers or whatever is the principal sound generator, but because there's a systematic effect on another music maker, for instance, then the system wouldn't necessarily know the difference. It would just see that's a part of the signal that I have effect on, so I'm going to make this sound in order to achieve a certain result. So it might not match our intuitive notions about who owns what sound. Okay, so the main idea about how you do this is, one idea for how one can do this, one idea I'm interested in investigating, is to generalize something that I presented at the first Hound workshop here at Sussex. So then I talked about a simple form of non-evaluative control. I talked about a singer listening to itself in order to, say, more faithfully reproduce a particular pitch. And then I made a distinction between merely feeding back, hearing what the sound you're making, and then seeing how it deviates from, say, a target, and then altering your output based on that. Versus something a little bit more sophisticated, which is prediction-based control, where instead of actually waiting for the sound to be fed back to you, you have a forward model that predicts what the output might be, and this is something we find in certain kinds of motor circuits. You predict the output that you think is going to be made and use that inner feedback, that estimate of what the sonic input will be at a certain time as your guide to, as a guide to producing a particular sound, a particular goal sound. Well, I'm generalizing that away from this idea of having a static, a fixed goal or a pre-specified objective, but rather have a notion of evaluative control where, yes, there is this either direct feedback where you wait and listen to your own output, or this predictive, internal predictive feedback where you try to predict the signal that you will be getting soon, predicting the output you're going to make, but you don't just compare that to a specification of what you want and then say, make an adjustment. You actually evaluate that output and say, is that a good, that's one previously you mentioned comparison is one kind of degenerate or very simple form of doing evaluation, but one could instead have a more complex forms of evaluation that could guide one could allow that feedback or predicted feedback signal to guide one's sound generation. Here's an anthropomorphic analogy to make that point maybe a little clearer. The difference between this feedback-based evaluative control versus prediction-based evaluative control is like the difference between one case where you hear yourself singing and you think, damn, that was the wrong note, I need to change what I'm doing, or damn, I'm flat, I need to sing a little more sharply. So that's the feedback-based evaluative control. Whereas another approach might be hearing yourself sing and taking that result in, well, actually, in this case, if it's predictive, you wouldn't necessarily hear yourself sing, but your estimate of what the sound you're going to make when you do, of what you're going to sound like in a few seconds, and taking that data in neutrally, not evaluating it as being good or bad, but instead taking it in and using it as a guide in coming up with possible outputs, and those will be evaluated as being good or bad. So your own output is not evaluated your actual output isn't evaluated. Your actual output is taken into account when your potential future outputs are evaluated and considered. So those are the two. They're not meant to be mutually exclusive. I think both have a role to play: feedback-based evaluation and predictive-based evaluation. Okay, that's enough of that. So I talk about evaluation here. Evaluation is important to this approach. What do I mean by evaluation? What would it be for a system to say, oh, that's a good sound, that's a better sound than another? Well, there's some, you could build in some heuristic preferences or a priori features like, oh, let's impose conventional harmonic structure. But I'm more interested in a subjective notion of goodness that will basically drive kind of complexity or novelty. So this will take a minute or two to step through, but I think it's worth it. I think this is an interesting idea for how you could have a system that prefers a certain kind of walking the line between simplicity and complexity that will end up, if it's built in the right way, in forcing it to find more and more complex forms of output to please itself. So to what extent does a question that can be asked is, to what extent does the signal that the system is producing, what extent does it walk the line between being easily predictable, is it just a simple pattern, say, versus, and therefore completely predictable, versus being complete noise, completely uncompressible, completely unpredictable. So a practical way to express that question in an algorithmic system would be having the system attempting to retrospectively predict the current signal. So it gets some data and it says, now could I have expected that? How could I have predicted that? Could I have predicted that signal? Or you could just not be doing retrodiction, you could just be making predictions and then looking at how far the actual signal deviates from your predictions. But the notion of retrodiction is what I'll focus on here. So given the actual sonic signal at a particular time, the system tries to make sense of it, tries to compress it, tries to, in some sense, recover that, come up with a means of recovering that signal, or as much of it as possible, with a much more compact encoding. And the degree to which that signal is positively evaluated will in part be proportional to the amount of resources that the system must expend in order to successfully retrodict or compress that signal. Now, that might seem to be the opposite. You might think, surely if you can do it easily, that would be more satisfying. But I think if you have a system that actually finds it boring and uninteresting and not a good signal, if it can easily compress it, that's going to be more interesting than a system that seeks that out. Oh, I like that because I can easily compress it. You won't get, if you apply self-listening to that system, you won't get the kind of interesting dynamic that I think you'll get with a system that prefers signals that challenge it. So it doesn't like noise because it can't successfully retrodict it. It doesn't like simple because, at least after a point, after a certain level of maturity, it doesn't like that because that's too easily recoverable and compressible. But the in-between, the textured area in between, that's what's going to excite the system and give the most positive evaluations for it. So the model that it comes up with, it has to come up with something that's less complex to the signal itself. You can't just have the signal itself be supposedly the model of it. And you have to have a time limit to say, there should be some restriction on, you keep things real time, and also to prevent arbitrary complex signals from being preferred. You need to have some temporal constraint on this. And I'd like to make a distinction between the effort with which a system has to expend in order to do compression from the amount of compression achieved. I think, yes, the amount of compression achieved should increase the positive evaluation, but that's different from the effort that was expended in order to achieve that compression. So I think the idea of how many cycles had to be run, how many branches in a search tree, whatever measure of effort you're going to use, that's the process of finding the compression. The compression itself might be highly rated because it's highly compressive, even though it took a lot of effort to get to it. So I think that's important to distinguish those two. And obviously, the more accurate the recovery signal, the model is of the signal, the better. So why would it be useful to have this notion of evaluation? Well, the way you use it in a system that's that's going to generate sound is the following. You have a system that has a forward model, say a neural network, of what sonic output it expects if it were to make a particular musical intervention in a given context. And then the expected output of a given intervention is evaluated using the kind of evaluation functions I just went into, the ones that prefer a lot of effort in compressing, prefer a great deal of compression, etc. And then the result of this evaluation is fed back to the generative system in order to guide what output is actually made. So is that a good output? Is it something that I would like to hear? Does it produce a signal that I would like, or does it produce a signal that's predictable and is easily compressible? So that's the way in which the evaluation would guide generation. And an important point is, and I hinted at this earlier when I did the sing-song, the minor third sing-song, is that what counts as good will be a moving target in this system. So if you have a system where the very activity of attempting to retrodict a sonic signal X makes it the case that you will have to spend less effort in the future if you were to try and retrodict X, then if you have a system like that, then it'll be the case that the evaluation of X will decrease over time. So X might have been really interesting at first because, and highly evaluated very positively because there's this great compression and it took a lot of effort to find it. But once I've already done that, once I've gone through that process and have done that retrodiction, if it's now no longer difficult for me to retrodict X because I've now learned that pattern, then X isn't as, the second time I encounter X, it isn't quite as positively evaluated because it's been done. Yeah, I got that. You're not challenging me anymore. I'm not challenging myself anymore. So you get a kind of habituation for free. It's not imposed. It's a byproduct of the different forces involved here. And so the evaluated activity of the generator subsystem will always be in a kind of competition with the evaluation subsystem. So the generator subsystem will have to constantly change and increase the complexity of its output if it's going to please the evaluation subsystem, because the evaluation subsystem gets bored. You can't wow it. You give it chocolates one anniversary, it finds that great, but if you give it chocolates the next anniversary, it's not so impressed, right? So you've got to constantly be changing. So the byproduct of this, I think, should be that you'll have novelty, creativity, complexity as the outcome of this runaway competition between the generator and the evaluator. So now I get to this project, like evaluating the project. What would success in doing this, in realizing this system look like? Well, I don't know, but some possible variables to look, I'd just really like to hear it. I'd like to see if this system develops, and a community of these systems would be even more interesting, right? But this system on its own, does it develop its own aesthetic and then just goes off on a runaway process, departing more and more from our aesthetic, and just prefers these very odd, arbitrary, but complex, but particularly structured sonic events or signals, or if you seed it with enough of our a priori preferences, could you end up getting something that we also would find interesting too? Or are we malleable enough that we could quickly acquire its aesthetic? I'd be interested in that. But on a more less social, on a more quantitative approach, just looking at the system itself rather than our response to it, we could look at look at the accuracy of the forward model. Does it actually have a good model of what sound events will occur as a result of it making different interventions? And how does that change over time? Do you only get interesting results if it does achieve an accurate forward model, or could just some model, even if it's inaccurate, be enough to get some interesting results? It'd be also be good to look at the complexity of the output over time. The signals it generates, according to some relatively objective measures, do the signals get more and more complex, or is there no measurable progress there? What about the system's evaluation of its output over time? Does that change? What are the dynamics of that? Does it change? Does it increase? Does it stay static? And in two ways, looking at its evaluation of whatever the current output is. What does it think of what it's doing right now? What is that figure? How does it change over time? But also looking at specific previous outputs, like the thing that it first thought was really fantastic and evaluated very highly. Now at the end of the run, if you were to give it that signal again, would it then go, oh no, that's really boring, I've gone way beyond that? Or would it, can you introduce certain forgetting terms so that in certain situations it can rediscover the value of previous outputs that it neglected for a while, I thought was boring. So I think there might be some interesting dynamics there too. So in closing, last slide, the next steps are basically to ask, are there any takers? Is it just me, or is there anybody else here who would be interested in improving on or implementing this? And unrelated to that, I'll just say that ultimately what I really think would be great would be to have the sound generation not be I was disconnecting up with my previous talk. I'd like it if the sound generation weren't just mediated by a simple electronic synthesis, like either digital analog converter or even certain analog sound generating systems. I'd like it to be that the sound generation required robotic movement in the real world, but that's just because of a programmatic interest of mine. But that explains my last slide. These guys. Thanks.